You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron, live with Ethan Haristodoulou.
Welcome back, everyone, to more of the Greeks Gridiron. I am Ethan Haristodoulou, and today I am doing my USFL picks for week number 3. I released my round 1 reaction video to the NFL draft earlier today, so make sure you check that out if you have not already. I go over my favorite picks, my least favorite picks, and we talk some of the bigger news that came out from the night, breaking all the big stuff down. So make sure you check that out after you watch this video. So today, week 3 is tomorrow. It kicks off at 4 p.m. Eastern time with the Tampa Bay Bandits taking on the Houston Gamblers. Both teams are 1-1. Bandits are currently sitting at -1.5 with an over-under of 38.5. So if you look at what the Bandits are bringing to the table here, they're coming off a really big blowout loss against the Breakers where their defense struggled mightily against a very athletic and speed-focused offense of the Breakers. That is something that I'm definitely concerned about as we go through the duration of the season. They built their defense on name value, big schools, experience, and the such. But that defense had hands on hips in the second quarter. I mean, they looked, and to be fair, it was 82 degrees. It was a hot day, but the Breakers looked really good. Their defense was all over the place. There is definitely some concern for this Bandits team that a lot of people thought was ranked number 1 coming out of week number 1. I myself, I believed in the Breakers in that defense off the jump. I had them ranked number 1, but it's not looking good so far for this Bandits defense. And they did have a good week 1. They let up only 3 against the Maulers, but the Maulers went into that game with such a bad game plan that you almost wonder, well, was it the Bandits defense or was it just the Maulers game plan that was that bad? The offense is also struggling a little bit here too. They only put up 17 against the Maulers, and the Maulers do have a solid defense. I'll give them credit for that. But Jordan Te'amu did not really look great in that game last week. He led the team with rushing and 45 yards, so they got to get the ground game going. I think that's something they need to commit to in this next week. Take a little bit of pressure off Te'amu, who a lot of people thought was like the consensus best QB coming into the season for this league, and try to just establish a run game, control the tempo a little bit more. You're going up against a Gambler team that, they themselves struggle a little bit through the air. Clayton Thorson had 3 interceptions this past week, but the ground game over there, pretty aggressive, and if they get hit with a ground and pound, like running back Mark Thompson last week was carrying at a 5.8 yard a carry clip. That is going to be a problem for the Bandits defense if they cannot get that under control. Like I said, they had hands on hips last week dealing with the Breakers offense. If this offense from the Gamblers just continues to ground and pound the rock all game long and just bullies them up front, we're going to see a repeat. Like I said, Clayton Thorson just needs to slow down on the interceptions. 3 of them in a game is definitely not acceptable, and they could very well be 2-0 if Clayton Thorson doesn't throw even just 2 of those 3 interceptions. And if the defense gets rolling, the Gamblers are they're a very defensive-heavy team, and they're not afraid to get after it, be aggressive, and try to turn the ball over. They have 5 turnovers forced in these last 2 weeks. So if I'm looking at the odds, I actually do not like Bandits sitting at -1.5. I'm going with the underdogs in this one here. Give me the Gamblers. And I'm going to take the under with a score line of 20-14 on this one here. I think the Gamblers edge them out in a close one. I think defense kind of prevails in this game. I don't know about if it's going to be more so about the Bandits' defense slowing the Gamblers' offense down, but the Gamblers have just been prone to mistakes offensively, so I think it keeps the game in a little bit of a lower scoring affair, and I do believe in the Gamblers' defense. It's probably my favorite part of this team. If they can just clean up the issues on offense, the Gamblers should be able to walk away with a win on this one, if I'm being upfront with you guys. Going into game number 2, this is my game of the week pick. Hopefully it ends up better than a blowout, because when I selected game of the week in week number 1, in week number 2, it was not the game of the week. It was a complete routing of the Breakers over the Bandits. So we got the Birmingham Stallions at 2-0 going up against the New Orleans Breakers at 2-0. This one will be in primetime television at 8 p.m. on Saturday. The Breakers obviously coming off of a massive blowout win over the Bandits, as we had just talked about. Their defense has claimed the number 1 spot in the USFL. They have a whopping 10 sacks, 19 tackles for loss, 5 turnovers forced through 2 weeks of play. This defense is ridiculous. Sorry, are firing on all cylinders. It was 6 sacks the first week, 4 last week. If this defense keeps it up, the defense wins championships, man. And I mean, at this point, I would say the Breakers are a favorite to bring home that championship. It's them and the Stallions at this moment in time, but I will say that the Breakers defense probably gives them the edge over the Stallions ever so slightly. The Breakers are favorites at -3.5 going into this game. The over-under sitting at 44.5. So people are expecting a little bit more of a high-scoring affair, and I'm curious as to why, because I would expect this game to maybe be a little bit lower scoring, but based off of the offenses that both of these teams have, I could see it maybe crossing the over here, but we'll get into that in a second. But yeah, the Breakers offense, they were able to clean up some issues last week. Kyle Sloter won Offensive Player of the Week. Some people would argue that Brian Scott was snubbed on that one. I think you have a fair case. Brian Scott had one more touchdown and a few more yards as well. I think it was just the routing of the Breakers that really helped Kyle Sloter win the award more than anything else. And then Jonathan Adams, man, talk about him and that one-handed grab he had last week, unbelievable. And then the combo of running back TJ Logan and Jordan Ellis on the ground after a really strong week 1, they doubled down and had another good week 2. So look to see the Breakers continue to focus on that ground game, whether it's, passing to them on the outside through the air or whatever it may be. I like the running back tandem they have there. I like who they have at quarterback. I personally think Kyle Sloter was probably the best quarterback taken for the league here in that draft that they had earlier in the year. And things are looking really good for the Breakers. Whereas on the Birmingham Stallions side, these guys are like your cardiac kids of the league. If I was to give them sort of like a namesake, through 2 weeks, they've won really tight contests pretty much within the final drive or two. They had a touchdown scored on the final offensive drive in week 1 to win the game. And then they had the interception to seal the game in week 2 against the Gamblers. So, I mean, this is a team that while I like what they're doing, they just give me a heart attack a little too much when it comes to their style of play. I will say that Jamar Smith, though, definitely QB1 going forward for this team. He had 260 yards total, 2 passing touchdowns, and an interception last week. I think that he has established himself that he is QB1 over Alex Magoo. And the defense is probably the weaker point of this team right now, whereas when you look at what the Breakers just did last week and how they've fared so far this season, when you look at what the Stallions have done defensively, they've allowed 24 and 28 points in their first 2 games this year. They got to tighten up. The Breakers D, it's no joke. And if the offense gets going and you can't keep up, that's going to be a problem. The Breakers, I do like them as the favorites in this one here, so I will take them as the winners coming into this game. And I do actually have the game going in the over. I'm curious as to why the over-under is so high in this game, and maybe we'll find out why coming into this game here, but it's at 44.5. I do have the Breakers winning 28-21 because I think that maybe the game does get a little... the Stallions have a better offense than I do think the Bandits have going for them, at least in this current moment. So maybe the game does run up a little bit higher, and the Stars were able to put up a decent amount of points against the Breakers the week prior, so we'll have to see how things shake out. I don't expect the Breakers to completely shut down the Stallions the way they did the Bandits just this past week. That would be bananas if they do that again, but I do like the Breakers 28-21 for the W. Going into game number 3 now, we are looking at the Maulers taking on the Panthers. Both teams are winless, sitting at 0-2. This is Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. This game actually got flexed out from the Saturday night game into the Sunday night game, or Sunday afternoon game, so that Breakers and Stallions could take the late night game on Saturday. Panthers are -2.5 favorites, surprisingly, in my opinion, and the over-under is sitting at 38.5. The Maulers offense looked better week 2 than it did week 1, like I mentioned earlier about when I was talking about the Bandits. The game plan the Maulers had going into week 1, I understand wanting to establish a ground game, but that was an absolute disaster of a way to start the game. You don't go 7 plays running the football and you just completely blow away your first 2 drives like that. That's not how that goes. You got to vary up the offense a little bit, and I think the Maulers did a much better job game plan-wise going into week number 2. QB Josh Love, he's been a little bit up and down. Wide receiver Bailey Gaither, though, or Gaither. I'm not 100% sure on the pronunciation on that one. 7 catches, 117 yards. He had a touchdown, stepped up big time for the team. Looked pretty good last week despite the loss. The ground game is looking pretty solid over there in Pittsburgh as well. I feel like they're finally starting to find their footing, and they're figuring out what they have. Groshek and London averaged a combined 4.4 yards a carry for 123 yards total, and they held the Bandits to only 17 points just last week on defense. So I think that the Maulers group altogether, they're a pretty solid unit. They have 5 turnovers forced, and really, they just need to clean up their offensive turnovers. They clean that up, and this team could very well be 1-1, maybe even battling for, had been battling for 2-0 last week. I think that it's more just that it was the game planning week 1 and just offensive turnovers that have been kind of holding this team back from reaching its full potential, which I think as we go through the season, things will clean up a little bit and we'll get the true contenders in the league as teams kind of figure themselves out these first few weeks. But I like what the Maulers have. It's just a matter of getting to where their potential is. As for the Panthers, like I said, I'm surprised they're the favorites going into this game here. I think the offense has looked very dysfunctional through 2 weeks. They're averaging a measly 3.1 yards per play. Shea Patterson has not looked comfortable playing behind the offensive line over there. The ground game was literally non-existent, averaging 2.6 yards a carry. They had a touchdown, but only 74 yards on the ground. I will say that I give credit to the defense there. They looked pretty solid, holding the Generals to only 10 points. They had a pick, they had a forced fumble, but the team has only 1 sack through 2 games. I mean, there is just a lot to not like about the Panthers, and I'm curious as to why the Panthers are the favorites going into this game. I feel like everything that I just discussed here points to the Maulers being the more successful team so far, despite what happened to the Maulers week 1. I mean, the Panthers have been worse. So I'm going to take the Maulers in this one. I like them 23-13. I am going the under on this. 23-13 obviously puts you at a score total of 36, so a couple points below that 38.5 over-under mark. I think offensively the Panthers are really struggling here unless they just come out and surprise me. I mean, they have not really looked good through the first 2 weeks, so I don't have a reason to believe they're just going to come out and dominate a Pittsburgh defense that's been pretty solid so far. And the Maulers offense has been, they're figuring themselves out. So I think the game ends up being a lower scoring affair. And again, I like the Maulers. They get the win 23-13. And then going in for game number 4, this is Sunday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We're looking at the New Jersey Generals going up against the Philadelphia Stars. Both teams are 1-1 and should be a fun matchup to watch. The Stars are a slight favorite at -1.5, and the over-under is currently sitting at 40.5. The Generals offense slowed down a lot in week number 2 after having a really tight game with the Stallions in week 1. The Luis Perez and DeAndre Johnson combo thing that they got going on there, while I understand you're trying to figure out maybe who your quarterback is, or maybe they want to run the dual QB system, I am a firm believer of the if you have 2 quarterbacks, you have no quarterbacks kind of group. That's been that's something I've always believed in, that the 2 QB system does not really make sense to me. I talked a little bit about Marcus Mariota jumping in for the Raiders, I believe talking about the Generals during my power rankings earlier this week, and while I get something like that where you have an extra, a gadget quarterback guy that has really good legs, but can also maybe throw the ball every now and again for you, running a play or 2 here and there, you're splitting reps between Perez and Johnson. How can one quarterback get into a rhythm if you're just constantly flip-flopping them, Doesn't make sense to me. They combined for 145 yards passing and only a touchdown. So offensively, they got to sort that out. Once they sort that out, I think the Generals will be a little bit more consistent on offense. And really, if you keep finding yourselves going for DeAndre Johnson because of his athleticism, stick with DeAndre Johnson. I was very surprised with Luis Perez the first week. Second week, he looked more so like what I would have expected had I known Luis Perez was going to be the starter in week number 1, because I honestly thought DeAndre Johnson was going to be QB1 going into week 1, and he wasn't. So I think you need to pick a quarterback and stick with him. And again, if you're leaning to Johnson because of athleticism and whatnot and what he can do on the ground, then just go with Johnson as QB1. I believe he completed 5 or 6 of his passes or something last week too. Other than that, defense, solid job last week as well. Panthers let up 2 sacks and 6 tackles for loss when they were playing against the Generals. So, I mean, the Gamblers, overall, solid unit. Offensively, took a step back this week. The defense still looked pretty good. The Stars, after coming out with a loss, and a tight, heartbreaking loss at that, a pretty close game over there in when they were going up in week 1 against the Breakers, came out swinging, and they were very competitive, and the Maulers actually brought it to them as well. And again, like I said, Maulers kind of surprised me last week. But Brian Scott, best QB performance so far this year. Like I said, I'm a little bit surprised that he didn't win the Offensive Player of the Week award. Shout out to Kyle Sloter. I am a Breakers fan, so shout out to him. I'm pumped he got it, but you have an argument for Brian Scott getting snubbed. He had 26 of 36 completions, 272 yards, 4 touchdowns total, 1 on the ground and 3 through the air, and then only 1 interception. I mean, it was the best showing so far. Wide receiver Maurice Alexander was a big piece of that. 8 catches, 87 yards, and a couple of touchdowns. I think that this offense has looked really good. The running back tandem that we kind of saw pop off a little bit in week 1, a little bit slower this week. It was more of an air game for this team than anything else, which, I mean, if you have the hot hand at quarterback, then you might as well just roll with it, right? You don't have to have an effective ground game if you're winning. Hey, 1 week, it is what it is. If Brian Scott had the hot hand, roll with it. It worked really well. He threw for 3 touchdowns and ran 1 in himself. So, I mean, it is what it is. But I mean, I like what they did offensively, and I liked what they did offensively week 1, considering how bad the Bandits looked against the Breakers defense and how solid the Philadelphia Stars defense or offense looked against the Breakers defense. I mean, the Stars got something going for them, that's for sure. And I mean, the defense, another solid week after a pretty solid week against the Breakers offense week 1. They had 3 sacks, 3 TFLs, 2 interceptions, and 8 pass breakups against the Maulers. So they were there, and they were making plays. I ultimately think, though, with this one here, I'm a little bit concerned about the Generals' offense. Like I mentioned, I really want them to just figure out who they're sticking with at quarterback. I don't like the flip-floppy thing that they're doing there, and I think it hurts them in the long run. I'm going to run with the Stars on this one here for the W, and I think that they win at a score of around 24-17. So I am taking the over on this one here. That puts me at, I believe, 41 points, so half a point over the over here. I think it'll be close. I'm not 100% sure on this one, if I'm being honest with you. Like if I was to be betting on over-unders, I probably wouldn't bet this game because it's a very close one in my opinion here. But I do think the Stars get the win 24-17. But those are my picks for the week. We went 4-0 last week, 1-3 in week number 1. I'm hoping for another solid week where, even if we just break even or maybe go 3-1, that would be awesome. Another 4-0 week would be excellent. But let me know who you guys think in the comment section down below wins games this week. And then be sure to come back on Monday for my power rankings video that I do after every weekend of games. I appreciate you all for watching. I will see you guys next time.